Route 66, Motorcycle Rally, Amarillo, Texas. September 2019. The vintage bike show had drawn 300 riders from across the Southwest, their machines gleaming under the Texas sun, while judges walked between rows evaluating chrome and paint and engine work. Jacob Diesel Murphy was holding court near his 1947 Harley Knucklehead, a restoration project that had taken him 4 years and cost more than his truck. He was explaining cylinder head modifications to a circle of admirers when a kid, maybe 13 years old, stopped at the rope barrier and stared at the engine with an intensity that made Diesel pause mid-sentence. The boy's clothes were worn, but clean, his sneakers held together with duct tape, and he carried a backpack that looked like it weighed more than he did. What happened next would start with Diesel's casual mockery, escalate into something nobody at that rally expected, and end with a community discovering that genius doesn't care about your age or your bank account. It would also reveal a story about a boy who taught himself engineering from library books because learning was the only thing that made sense when everything else in his life had fallen apart. If you value stories about people who prove that talent and determination matter more than circumstances, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts of extraordinary ability showing up in unexpected places. Diesel had been building and riding bikes for 32 years, ever since his father had brought home a broken Sportster when Diesel was 16 and told him if he wanted to ride it, he'd have to fix it first. That Sportster had taught him everything about engines through trial and error, skinned knuckles, and more than a few mistakes that left parts scattered across his father's garage floor. By the time he was 20, Diesel could tear down and rebuild any motorcycle engine blind, and by 30, he'd opened his own custom shop in Fort Worth that built bikes for clients across the country. The knucklehead at the rally represented his masterpiece. He'd found the frame in a barn outside Lubbock, rusted and bent, but salvageable. The engine had been seized solid, cylinder walls scored beyond what most mechanics would consider repairable. Diesel had spent 8 months machining new parts, hand-fitting components, and rebuilding the valve train to tolerances that would make the bike run like it did in 1947, but with reliability that matched modern engineering. The kid standing at the rope barrier was named Ethan Cole, and he'd ridden his bicycle 11 miles from the trailer park where he lived with his grandmother to see the vintage bikes at the rally. His mother had died from cancer 2 years earlier, and his father had disappeared shortly after the funeral, leaving Ethan with his grandmother Martha, a woman who worked 2 jobs to keep them housed and fed, but had nothing left over for things like hobbies or motorcycle shows. Ethan had discovered motorcycles through a book at the public library, a technical manual about Harley-Davidson engines that someone had donated years ago. The diagrams and specifications had captivated him in ways that school never had. He checked out every book the library had on engines, mechanics and engineering, teaching himself principles of combustion, valve timing, and compression ratios, while other kids his age were playing video games. He'd never actually worked on a real motorcycle. His grandmother didn't have one and couldn't afford to buy him anything beyond basic necessities. But Ethan had spent hundreds of hours studying schematics, memorizing torque specifications, and imagining what it would be like to actually touch the engines he'd only seen in photographs and technical drawings. Now he stood at the barrier, staring at Diesel's knucklehead, his eyes tracking across the engine's exposed valve train, the hand-polished rocker boxes, the carburetor setup that looked slightly non-standard. His mind was processing what he saw, comparing it to the diagrams he'd memorized from his library books, and recognizing something that didn't match the factory specifications. Diesel noticed the kid staring and felt a flash of annoyance. The boy wasn't admiring the bike the way most people did, with general appreciation for how pretty it looked. He was studying it with focused intensity, his eyes moving in a pattern that suggested he was actually analyzing the engineering rather than just looking at chrome. "You like the bike, kid?" Diesel asked. his tone carrying a slight edge. Ethan looked up, startled out of his concentration. "Your rocker arm geometry is wrong. The pushrod angle is about 2 degrees off from factory spec, which means you're getting uneven valve lift and probably losing about 8% efficiency on your intake stroke." The circle of admirers around Diesel went quiet. Several of them were experienced mechanics and builders themselves, and they recognized that what the kid had just said was either complete nonsense or a legitimate technical observation that none of them had noticed. Diesel's expression shifted from annoyance to incredulity. "Kid, I've been building bikes since before you were born. The rocker arm geometry is exactly where it needs to be. I measured it 3 times with precision tools." Ethan nodded, not argumentative but not backing down either. "Your measurements were probably correct for the rocker arms you installed, but those aren't original 1947 knucklehead rockers. They're from a 1952 panhead, which have a slightly different pivot point location. The mounting holes line up so they fit, but the geometry doesn't match the cylinder head angle, so your valve timing is off by about 6 degrees on the intake side." Diesel stared at the kid, trying to process what he'd just heard. The rocker arms were indeed from a panhead. He'd sourced them from a parts supplier after finding that original knucklehead rockers in good condition were nearly impossible to locate and cost more than he wanted to spend. The supplier had assured him they were compatible, and they'd bolted right on without any apparent issues. The bike ran fine, maybe not quite as strong as he'd expected, but he'd attributed that to the engine, having 70-year-old bottom-end components. "How the hell would you know what year those rocker arms are from?" Diesel demanded. "You've been crawling under the rope to inspect my bike." "No, sir. The rocker arms have a different relief cut pattern on the bearing surface. Knucklehead rockers from 1936 to 1947 have a single oil relief groove. Panhead rockers from 1948 onward have a double groove pattern for better lubrication. I can see the double groove from here, and the pivot pin diameter is larger on panheads, which changes the mechanical advantage ratio slightly." One of the other bikers in the circle, a man named Pete Rodriguez, who'd been building Harleys for 40 years, leaned in to look more closely at the rocker arms. He pulled a small flashlight from his pocket and examined the bearing surface. After a moment, he looked up at Diesel with an expression of surprise. "Kid's right. Those are panhead rockers. You can see the double groove right there." Diesel felt heat rising in his face, a combination of embarrassment and anger at being corrected by a 13-year-old in front of his peers. He'd spent 4 years on this restoration and had just been told by a child that he'd made a fundamental error that was costing him performance. "Okay, smart guy," Diesel said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "If you're such an expert, what would you do to fix it, assuming there's actually a problem, which I'm not convinced about?" Ethan considered the question seriously, not recognizing the mockery in Diesel's tone or choosing to ignore it. "You'd need to either source correct knucklehead rocker arms or machine custom push rods that are 3/8 of an inch longer to compensate for the geometry change. The longer push rods would restore the correct valve lift profile, though you'd also need to adjust your valve clearances to account for the length difference. Or you could mill the rocker box mounting surfaces by about 0.040 inches to change the mounting angle, but that's riskier because you might crack the casting." Pete was nodding slowly, following the logic. That would work. The longer push rods would be the easiest fix. Valve clearances would need to be reset anyway after changing push rods. Diesel felt control of the situation slipping away. This kid who'd appeared out of nowhere was not only identifying a problem with his prized restoration, but providing technically sound solutions that other experienced builders were agreeing with. His pride was taking a beating, and he responded the way people often do when their expertise is challenged, with defensive aggression. "Tell you what, kid, you think you're so smart, you think you can diagnose problems just by looking at an engine. "I've got a bike in my trailer that won't run right. Been trying to figure it out for 2 weeks. You identify the problem, I'll give you $50. But when you can't figure it out because you're just a kid who read some books, you apologize for wasting my time and talking about things you don't actually understand." The other bikers shifted uncomfortably. This had escalated from technical discussion to something that felt like bullying. A grown man with decades of experience challenging a teenager to prove himself or be humiliated. But Ethan just nodded, missing or ignoring the hostile undertone. "Okay. Can I see the bike?" Diesel led the group toward his trailer, parked at the edge of the rally grounds. Inside was a 1969 shovelhead that he'd been trying to diagnose for his cousin. The bike would start and idle but stumbled badly under load, backfiring through the carburetor and losing power above 3,000 RPM. Diesel had checked timing, cleaned the carburetor twice, replaced the spark plugs and wires, and adjusted the ignition system without solving the problem. He rolled the shovelhead down the trailer ramp and let it rest on its kickstand. "There you go, genius. Figure out what's wrong with it." Ethan set down his backpack and approached the bike carefully, not touching it yet, but looking at it from multiple angles. He studied the engine configuration, the carburetor setup, the ignition system components visible on the right side of the engine. Then he knelt down and looked up at the underside of the engine, checking oil lines and the bottom of the cylinders. "Can you start it?" Ethan asked. Diesel kicked the engine over, and it fired immediately, settling into a rough idle that sounded okay at first, but developed an irregular pattern after about 30 seconds. Ethan listened carefully, his head tilted like he was trying to isolate specific sounds within the overall engine noise. After about 2 minutes, he signaled for Diesel to shut it down. "Your intake manifold has an air leak, probably a cracked gasket or a crack in the casting itself. It's pulling unmetered air on the intake stroke, which leans out your fuel mixture under load. That's why it idles okay but stumbles when you try to accelerate. The backfiring through the carburetor is the lean mixture igniting in the intake tract." Diesel felt his stomach drop. He'd replaced the intake manifold gaskets as part of his troubleshooting, but he hadn't actually inspected the manifold casting itself for cracks because the bike was only 50 years old and the manifold had looked fine externally. "Dish, how do you know it's the manifold and not a dozen other things that could cause the same symptoms?" "The irregular idle pattern. It's not consistent, which means the air leak isn't constant. A cracked manifold flexes slightly with engine vibration, opening and closing the crack. That creates the pattern you're hearing. Also, I can smell raw fuel when the engine's running, which means some of the mixture is burning in the intake instead of the cylinder, and there's a faint hissing sound between the front cylinder and the carburetor body that shouldn't be there." Pete had been listening to this exchange with growing amazement. "Kid, how old are you?" 13. I'll be 14 in November. "Where'd you learn this stuff?" "Library books mostly, and I watch repair videos online when I can get internet access at school." Diesel was processing the implications of what he'd just heard. If the kid was right and a manifold inspection revealed a crack, then this 13-year-old had diagnosed in 5 minutes what Diesel hadn't figured out in 2 weeks. His pride was demanding he dismiss the diagnosis, but his professional experience was telling him the kid's logic was sound. "Yo, Pete, you got a can of carburetor cleaner in your truck?" Pete nodded and walked off to retrieve it. When he returned, Diesel sprayed carburetor cleaner around the intake manifold mounting surfaces while the engine idled. The RPMs immediately jumped as the engine sucked in the flammable cleaner through whatever gap existed. The test confirmed an air leak exactly where Ethan had said it would be. Diesel shut down the engine and just stood there for a moment, trying to reconcile his understanding of the world with what had just happened. A teenage kid with duct-taped shoes and no apparent access to motorcycles or tools had just outperformed him in his own area of expertise, using nothing but observation, theoretical knowledge, and logical deduction. The other bikers were murmuring among themselves, impressed and curious about this kid who'd appeared from nowhere. Pete asked the question several of them were thinking. Ethan, you said you learned this from books. Have you ever actually worked on a real bike? No, sir. I've never touched a real motorcycle engine, just studied them. The silence that followed that statement was profound. Everyone present understood the implications. This kid had developed expert-level diagnostic ability purely from theoretical study, which suggested a level of natural aptitude that was genuinely extraordinary. Diesel pulled out his wallet and counted out $50, before handing it to Ethan. You earned it, kid. I apologize for being a jerk about it. That was good work. Ethan took the money with a slightly dazed expression, like he couldn't quite believe what had just happened. $50 was more than his grandmother made in a half-day of work at the diner where she waitressed. Thank you, sir. I'm sorry if I was rude about your knucklehead. I didn't mean to be disrespectful. You weren't rude. You were right, which is worse for my ego but better for the bike. Diesel paused, studying the boy more carefully. You got any interest in actually learning to work on bikes, not just read about them? Ethan's face lit up with an expression of desperate hope. Yes, sir. More than anything. But I don't have tools or space or money for parts or... I run a custom shop in Fort Worth. We build bikes for clients, do restorations, fabrication work. You interested in an apprenticeship? Can't pay you much at first, but you'd learn from people who've been doing this professionally for decades. And you'd get your hands on bikes instead of just looking at pictures. The offer hung in the air while Ethan processed it, his expressions cycling through disbelief, hope, and worry in quick succession. I'd have to ask my grandmother. I don't know if she can drive me to Fort Worth. We don't have a reliable car. Where do you live? Trailer park off Highway 287, about 11 miles from here. I rode my bike to the rally. Pete spoke up before Diesel could respond. I live in Amarillo and work in Fort Worth 3 days a week doing long-haul trucking. I pass right by that trailer park. I could give the kid rides if his grandmother approves. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with multiple bikers offering solutions to logistical problems and expressing genuine interest in helping this kid develop his obvious talent. By the time Ethan left to ride his bicycle home, he had Diesel's business card, Pete's phone number, and the tentative framework of an arrangement that would let him start working at the custom shop 2 days a week. What nobody at the rally that day understood was that they'd just witnessed the beginning of something that would transform not just Ethan's life, but the entire Fort Worth custom motorcycle industry, and eventually lead to innovations that would catch the attention of major manufacturers and engineering programs at universities that usually didn't recruit from trailer parks. But first, Ethan had to convince his grandmother that letting him apprentice with bikers he'd just met at a rally was actually a good idea rather than the plot of a crime documentary. Martha Cole listened to her grandson explain what had happened at the motorcycle rally with an expression that cycled between pride, concern, and exhaustion. She'd raised Ethan since his mother died, working double shifts at the diner and cleaning offices at night to keep them housed and fed. The boy's education had been something she supported but couldn't actively help with, having dropped out of high school herself at 16 to work. That Ethan had taught himself engineering from library books while living in a trailer park was a source of amazement to her, but also worry because she knew how the world treated poor kids with big dreams. These bikers you met, they're offering you a job? Martha asked carefully, trying to assess whether this was a legitimate opportunity or something that would end badly. An apprenticeship, Ethan corrected. Diesel, he owns a custom motorcycle shop in Fort Worth. He said I could work there 2 days a week after school, learning to actually build bikes instead of just reading about them. And Pete, one of the other guys, he does trucking to Fort Worth 3 times a week and said he'd give me rides. Martha had been a waitress long enough to develop good instincts about people, and she'd also seen enough trouble to be cautious about men who showed unusual interest in teenage boys. Why would a successful shop owner want to teach a 13-year-old with no experience? Ethan explained about diagnosing the shovelhead's intake manifold crack, about identifying the wrong rocker arms on the knucklehead, about the bikers being impressed by his theoretical knowledge. Martha listened and recognized something in her grandson's voice she hadn't heard since before his mother got sick. Genuine hope. "You really want this?" she said. It wasn't a question. "More than anything, Grandma, I've been studying engines for 2 years, but I've never actually touched one. This would let me learn from people who do this professionally. It's the only chance I'm ever going to get to do something besides school and homework and eventually some minimum wage job." Martha made her decision based on her grandson's expression and the fact that multiple bikers, including one willing to provide transportation, had all offered to help. If this was some kind of setup, it was unusually elaborate, and if it was legitimate, turning it down would mean crushing the first real opportunity Ethan had ever been offered. "Okay, but I want to meet this Diesel and Pete first. You call them and arrange a meeting here at the trailer. I'm going to talk to them and decide if this is actually safe." The meeting happened 3 days later, on a Saturday afternoon. Diesel and Pete arrived in Pete's pickup truck, both men dressed in clean jeans and button-up shirts rather than their usual riding gear. They sat at Martha's small kitchen table, drinking coffee, while she asked direct questions about their backgrounds, their shop, and what exactly they planned to have Ethan doing. Diesel provided references from clients and other shop owners, including 2, who Martha called right there from her cell phone. Both gave glowing recommendations about Diesel's professionalism and skill. Pete provided his trucking company employment records and explained his route schedule that would allow him to pick up Ethan on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons and return him home by 8 p.m. "Mom, I understand your concern," Diesel said when Martha had finished her vetting. "You don't know us, and we're asking you to trust us with your grandson. All I can tell you is that I've got 3 daughters of my own, and if some stranger offered one of them an apprenticeship, I'd be asking the same questions you are. Here's what I propose. First month, you or someone you designate comes with Ethan to the shop. You watch what we're doing, you meet the other guys who work there, you see that this is a legitimate business, teaching him legitimate skills. After that, if you're comfortable, Ethan comes on his own. If you're not comfortable, we part ways with no hard feelings." Martha agreed to those terms. The following Tuesday, she called in sick to her evening office cleaning job and rode with Pete and Ethan to Fort Worth. The shop was exactly what Diesel had described: a professional operation with a client waiting area, 3 service bays, and a fabrication space where custom parts were machined and welded. The other employees, 2 mechanics named Carlos and Jim, were professional and friendly, treating Ethan with respect rather than condescension. That first evening, Ethan was given safety gear and basic instruction on shop procedures before being allowed to help Carlos perform an oil change and tire replacement on a customer's bike. Martha watched her grandson's face as he touched motorcycle parts for the first time, and she saw pure joy in his expression. By the time Pete drove them home that night, she'd decided the apprenticeship was legitimate. Over the following months, Ethan's education accelerated beyond what any book could have taught him. He learned to handle tools properly, to read service manuals, to diagnose problems through systematic testing rather than just theoretical analysis. Diesel discovered that the boy's photographic memory for technical specifications combined with hands-on experience created a mechanic who could work with unusual speed and accuracy. By his 3rd month at the shop, Ethan was performing basic services independently. By his 6th month, he was assisting on complex engine rebuilds and asking questions that challenged even Diesel's extensive knowledge. The boy's theoretical foundation meant he understood not just how to perform procedures, but why they worked, which made him naturally innovative when standard approaches didn't solve problems. The transformation caught the attention of customers who'd see this teenage kid working on their expensive custom bikes and initially worry, then see the quality of his work and become converts. One customer, a patent attorney named David Chen, who owned a vintage Indian Scout, was so impressed that he started bringing corporate clients by the shop specifically to see the kid genius mechanic as part of entertainment when they visited Fort Worth. One of those corporate visitors was Rebecca Thornton, an engineering executive from a major automotive manufacturer who was in town for business meetings. Chen brought her to Diesel's shop on a Friday afternoon in April 2020, 6 months into Ethan's apprenticeship, because he thought she'd be interested in seeing the boy's work. They arrived to find Ethan troubleshooting a 1965 panhead that had been through 3 other shops without anyone identifying why it consumed excessive oil. Ethan had the engine partially disassembled and was using a dial indicator to measure cylinder bore distortion. Work that required precision and understanding of tolerances most professional mechanics developed only after years of experience. Rebecca watched the 14-year-old work for 20 minutes before asking Diesel about his background. When she learned about the library books and the theoretical self-education, she pulled out her phone and made a call to someone she identified only as the Dean. "Tom, I'm standing in a motorcycle shop in Fort Worth, watching a 14-year-old kid from a trailer park perform precision measurement procedures that half my junior engineers can't do correctly. You need to meet him." That phone call started a chain of events that would eventually lead to Ethan receiving a full scholarship offer from a prestigious engineering program. But first, he'd have to finish high school while managing the attention that was starting to build around his unusual story. The oil consumption problem on the panhead turned out to be caused by excessive cylinder bore wear that created gaps, allowing oil to bypass the rings, exactly what Ethan's measurements indicated. His solution was to bore the cylinders due over and install new oversized pistons, standard procedure, but executed with precision that had the customer raving about the improved performance. Rebecca stayed in touch with Diesel after that visit, checking on Ethan's progress and eventually arranging for him to participate in a summer engineering camp at a university in Dallas. The camp was designed for high school juniors and seniors, but Rebecca got the age requirement waived after showing the program director videos of Ethan's work. Ethan attended the camp in summer 2020, just after finishing 8th grade. He was 2 years younger than most other participants and came from a dramatically different socio-economic background than the suburban kids whose parents had paid $3,000 for them to attend. The difference showed immediately in the first week's projects. While other students struggled with basic mechanical design principles, Ethan was applying advanced concepts from his motorcycle work to solve problems. When the instructors presented a challenge to design a valve timing system, Ethan sketched a solution in 15 minutes that incorporated variable timing principles he'd learned from studying modern fuel injection systems. His design was so sophisticated that the lead instructor, Dr. James Morrison, asked permission to use it in his graduate-level engineering course. The other students' reactions to Ethan varied. Some were impressed and sought his help with their projects. Others resented that someone younger and poorer was outperforming them. One incident during the 3rd week nearly got Ethan expelled, when a group of older students accused him of cheating after he scored perfectly on a thermodynamics exam that most of them had struggled with. Dr. Morrison investigated by giving Ethan an oral exam, asking him to explain the principles behind his answers. Ethan not only explained the textbook concepts, but related them to practical applications in motorcycle engines, demonstrating understanding that went beyond memorization into genuine comprehension. The cheating accusation was dismissed and the accusing students were reprimanded, but the incident highlighted the challenges Ethan would face as his talent became more visible. The summer camp ended with Ethan receiving the top student award and scholarship offers from 3 universities, contingent on him maintaining his grades through high school. But returning to 9th grade in Amarillo after spending 6 weeks with college-level engineering students created adjustment problems nobody had anticipated. His high school classes felt painfully slow and elementary after the camp. His teachers, while well-meaning, couldn't provide the level of intellectual challenge he needed. And his peers, most of whom had known him as the poor kid from the trailer park, didn't know how to relate to someone who was now being recruited by universities and featured in local news stories about gifted students. Ethan withdrew socially, spending lunch periods in the library, reading advanced engineering texts, and minimizing interaction with classmates who either resented his achievements or wanted to befriend him only because he was becoming known. His grades remained perfect, but his isolation worried Martha and Diesel, who recognized that academic success without social development could create problems. The motorcycle shop became Ethan's primary social outlet. The mechanics treated him as a colleague rather than a curiosity, valued his contributions, and provided the adult mentorship he needed. By his 15th birthday in November 2020, Ethan was working at the shop 4 days a week and handling repairs that Diesel trusted to only his most experienced mechanics. The work that changed everything came from an unexpected source. A customer named Michael Torres brought in a custom bike that had been built by a famous fabricator in California, a machine that had won multiple show awards for its innovative design. The bike was beautiful, but had a chronic overheating problem that nobody, including the original builder, had been able to solve. Torres had spent $15,000 at various shops trying to fix the overheating without success. He brought it to Diesel's shop because he'd heard about the kid who could diagnose anything and was willing to try one more solution before giving up on the bike entirely. Ethan spent 3 hours examining the motorcycle, running it through various operating conditions, measuring temperatures at dozens of points on the engine and frame. Finally, he identified the problem. The custom exhaust system, while gorgeous, created a heat trap where the pipes passed near the rear cylinder. The original builder had prioritized aesthetics over thermal management, and the result was a bike that looked incredible but overheated in normal riding conditions. The solution required redesigning part of the exhaust system to route heat away from critical areas while maintaining the visual design that made the bike special. This was beyond mechanical repair and into engineering design, something Ethan had theoretical knowledge about but had never actually done on a real project. "I can fix it," Ethan told Torres, "but it's going to require custom fabrication and probably 2 weeks of work. And I need to try some things that might not work on the first attempt." Torres looked at this 15-year-old kid offering to redesign an exhaust system that a famous builder had created. Everything about the situation said he should refuse and cut his losses on the bike. But something about Ethan's calm confidence, combined with Diesel's willingness to stake his shop's reputation on the solution, made Torres agree. "Do it. If you fix this thing, I'll pay you double your normal rate and buy you any tool you want for the shop." Ethan spent the next 2 weeks designing, fabricating, and testing a modified exhaust system that used heat-resistant materials and improved routing to solve the overheating problem. The work required skills in welding, metal forming, and thermal management that he'd learned partly from the shop and partly from university-level engineering techs he'd been studying. The modified bike ran 40 degrees cooler under normal operating conditions and eliminated the overheating problem completely. Torres was ecstatic. He paid double as promised, bought Ethan a professional-grade TIG welder for the shop, and posted photos of the bike on social media, crediting a 15-year-old genius mechanic in Fort Worth with solving a problem that had stumped everyone else. The post went viral in motorcycle communities. Within a week, Diesel's shop was receiving calls from across the country asking about the kid who'd redesigned the exhaust system. 3 motorcycle magazines requested interviews. And most significantly, the original California builder who'd created the bike called to ask if Ethan would be interested in an internship the following summer. The viral post about Ethan's exhaust redesign brought attention that transformed his quiet apprenticeship into something much larger and more complicated. By January 2021, Diesel's shop was receiving 30 to 40 calls per week from people wanting the genius kid to work on their bikes. Some were legitimate customers with real problems. Others were curiosity seekers who wanted to meet the teenager they'd read about online. A few were journalists working on human interest stories about gifted youth from disadvantaged backgrounds. Diesel handled the media requests carefully, protective of Ethan's privacy and aware that too much attention could harm rather than help the boy's development. He granted interviews to 3 motorcycle magazines and 1 local news station, always emphasizing that Ethan's talent came from dedicated study and hands-on learning, rather than some mysterious innate genius that required no effort. People want to believe that kids like Ethan are just naturally brilliant and everything comes easy to them, Diesel told a journalist from Cycle World magazine. What they don't see is the hundreds of hours he spent reading technical manuals at the library, or the way he studies every single procedure we do in the shop so he understands not just how, but why. His gift isn't that he's naturally smart. His gift is that he's willing to work harder than anyone else to learn what he doesn't know. The attention created opportunities, but also pressures. The California builder, Marcus Yang, who'd created the original overheating bike, offered Ethan a paid summer internship at his prestigious custom shop in Los Angeles for summer 2021. The position would expose Ethan to the highest level of motorcycle fabrication and design, working alongside craftsmen whose bikes sold for 6 figures and were featured in museums. But accepting meant leaving his grandmother alone for 3 months, giving up his regular shop work in Fort Worth and immersing himself in an environment where he'd be the youngest person by 15 years and the poorest by an even larger margin. Martha encouraged him to accept despite her private worries about her 15-year-old grandson living 3 states away. "You can't turn down opportunities like this because you're worried about me," she told Ethan when he hesitated. "I've been taking care of myself since I was younger than you. You go to California, you learn everything they can teach you, and you come back with skills that will let you build a real future." Ethan flew to Los Angeles in June 2021, his first time on an airplane and his first time leaving Texas. Yang's shop occupied a converted warehouse in the industrial area, a space filled with mills, lathes, welding stations, and bikes in various stages of construction that represented the cutting edge of custom motorcycle design. The other fabricators were artists as much as mechanics, people who could visualize complex 3-dimensional forms and then create them from raw metal. The first week was intimidating. Ethan's theoretical knowledge and diagnostic skills were exceptional, but the fabrication work at Yang's shop required artistic vision and manufacturing techniques he'd never attempted. He watched the other builders shape metal into flowing curves, weld with the precision of surgeons, and integrate electronic systems that controlled everything from suspension to lighting to engine management. Jung assigned him to work alongside a master fabricator named Sarah Chen, a woman who'd been building custom bikes for 20 years and had patience for teaching that others in the shop lacked. She recognized that Ethan's hesitation came from lack of exposure rather than lack of ability, and she approached his education systematically. "But you can diagnose and repair anything," Sarah told him during his second day. "Now I'm going to teach you to create things that don't exist yet. Different skill set, same fundamental principle. You learn the rules, you understand why they work, then you know when and how to break them to make something new." Over the following weeks, Ethan learned metal shaping, advanced welding techniques, computer-aided design for custom parts, and the artistic principles that separated merely functional work from genuinely beautiful work. Sarah pushed him hard, critiquing his efforts with professional standards rather than the encouragement adults often gave to teenage efforts. "That weld is garbage," she'd say, pointing to what Ethan thought was acceptable work. "It's structurally sound but ugly. Grind it out and do it again." In this shop, everything has to be both perfect and beautiful. The criticism stung but drove improvement. By his 6th week, Ethan was producing work that met Yang's standards for customer bikes. His mechanical understanding combined with newly developed fabrication skills let him solve problems that stumped other builders. When a customer's bike needed a custom oil cooler integrated into a frame with minimal space, Ethan designed a solution that was both thermally efficient and visually integrated into the bike's aesthetic. Yang was impressed enough to feature Ethan's work in his shop's social media, carefully framing it as collaborative effort rather than solo achievement to avoid building resentment among other builders. The posts generated predictable attention, with some people celebrating the teenager's accomplishments and others questioning whether he was really doing the work or just taking credit for others' efforts. The skepticism led to an incident in Ethan's 9th week that would become a defining moment in his development. A customer named Robert Hayes visited the shop to check on his bike's progress and expressed doubt that a 16-year-old could actually be contributing meaningful work to the build. Yang, irritated by the implication, challenged Hayes directly. "Ethan designed and fabricated the entire intake system for your bike. It's sitting on the bench in the welding bay. You think it's not real work? Go look at it and tell me what you think is wrong with it." Hayes examined the intake manifold assembly, a complex piece involving multiple bends, precise welding, and integration of fuel injection components. The work was flawless, both functionally and aesthetically. He ran his fingers over the welds, looking for imperfections, and found none. "This is professional quality work," Hayes admitted. "If a kid really built this, he's got a future in the industry." "He's got a future regardless," Yang said sharply. And he's standing right there. So maybe address your comments to him instead of talking about him in third person like he's not in the room." The exchange highlighted a pattern Ethan had experienced throughout his apprenticeship. Adults constantly expressed amazement at his abilities, while simultaneously doubting that his work could be as good as advertised, requiring repeated proof that became exhausting. The attention that seemed positive often carried an undercurrent of skepticism or condescension that dismissed his agency and reduced him to a curiosity rather than a craftsman. Sarah recognized Ethan's frustration during a conversation in the shop's break room later that day. "My people are going to doubt you until you're 40 and established," she told him, "not because your work isn't good enough, but because success at your age violates their expectations about how life is supposed to work. You're poor, you're young, and you're outperforming people with decades more experience. That makes them uncomfortable, so they doubt rather than accept. How do you deal with that? You keep working. You document everything so your contributions are undeniable, and you remember that their doubt is about their limitations, not yours. 5 years from now, you'll be taking commissions and building under your own name, and the doubters won't matter." The summer internship ended in late August, with Yang offering Ethan a permanent position after high school, either as a builder in the shop or with financial backing to start his own operation if he preferred independence. The offer came with a salary that would lift Ethan and his grandmother out of poverty immediately, but accepting meant forgoing the university scholarships he'd been offered. Ethan discussed the decision with Martha, Diesel, and his teachers during his junior year of high school. The consensus was that the university education would provide opportunities that pure shop experience couldn't match, particularly if he wanted to eventually work in engineering rather than just fabrication. He could always return to building bikes, but the window for formal education was narrower. He accepted a full scholarship to study mechanical engineering at Texas A&M, starting in fall 2022 after graduating high school with a perfect GPA and test scores that reflected his self-taught knowledge base. The university experience was challenging in unexpected ways. The coursework was easier than anticipated because he'd already learned most of the material through practical application. But the social environment was difficult, with privileged classmates who couldn't relate to someone who'd lived in a trailer park and whose idea of entertainment was reading technical manuals. Ethan found his community among graduate students and faculty who valued his practical experience and collaborated with him on research projects. His sophomore year, he co-authored a paper on thermal management in high-performance engines that was published in the Society of Automotive Engineers journal. His junior year, he designed a variable valve timing system that a major manufacturer licensed for development. Throughout college, he continued working at Diesel's shop during breaks, maintaining the relationships that had launched his career. The shop had expanded significantly, partly due to the reputation boost from Ethan's early work there. Diesel hired 3 more mechanics and moved to a larger facility, crediting the kid who could diagnose anything with attracting the customer base that made growth possible. Marcus Yang stayed in touch as well, sending Ethan challenging design problems and commissioning custom parts that Ethan would fabricate during summer breaks. The relationship evolved from mentorship to professional collaboration, with Yang treating Ethan as a peer rather than a student by the time he reached his 20s. Ethan graduated from Texas A&M in 2026 with degrees in mechanical engineering and business, having decided that he wanted to build bikes commercially rather than work in corporate engineering. He returned to Fort Worth and opened his own custom shop, funded partly by Yang's investment and partly by crowdfunding from the motorcycle community that had followed his story for years. The shop, named Cole Custom Engineering, specialized in solving problems other builders couldn't handle and creating bikes that integrated advanced engineering with traditional craftsmanship. His first major commission came from a collector who wanted a vintage Indian Scout, updated with modern performance while maintaining period-correct appearance. The build took 6 months and resulted in a bike that was featured in 4 magazines and won Best Engineering at the premier custom bike show in the country. By age 24 in 2030, Ethan employed 8 people, including 2 other young mechanics from disadvantaged backgrounds who he was mentoring the way Diesel had mentored him. His annual revenue exceeded $2 million, and his bikes commanded waiting lists of 18 months for custom builds. Martha retired from waitressing and moved into a house Ethan bought for her, finally able to rest after decades of working multiple jobs. She'd visit the shop weekly, bringing lunch for the crew and watching her grandson teach younger apprentices with the same patience and high standards that Sarah Chen had shown him years earlier. Diesel, now in his 60s and thinking about retirement, would stop by Cole Custom Engineering and marvel at what had grown from that September day at the motorcycle rally when a 13-year-old kid had corrected him about rocker arm geometry. The knucklehead with the wrong rocker arms sat in Ethan's shop now, purchased from Diesel and restored correctly, a reminder of where everything had started. "You know what I think about sometimes," Diesel said during one visit, looking at the knucklehead. What would have happened if I dismissed you that day, instead of offering the apprenticeship? You'd probably still have made it somehow. But I would have missed being part of something extraordinary." Ethan considered the question seriously. "I think about that too. What if I'd been too scared to correct you about the rocker arms? What if I hadn't gone to the rally at all? There were so many points where things could have gone differently." "But they didn't. You took your shot when it mattered, and you backed it up with work that proved you belonged. That's the real lesson here. Talent matters, but so does courage and timing and being ready when opportunity shows up. The story of Ethan Cole became a case study used in educational programs about gifted youth from disadvantaged backgrounds. Researchers studied his development to understand how self-taught expertise could reach professional levels without formal instruction. Motorcycle industry veterans pointed to him as an example of how mentorship and practical apprenticeship could develop skills that academic programs alone couldn't teach. But for Ethan, the most important legacy was the young mechanics he was training in his shop, kids from trailer parks and rough neighborhoods who reminded him of himself at 13. He worked with local libraries to improve their technical book collections. He created a scholarship fund for youth pursuing engineering education, and he made sure that when talented kids showed up with nothing but determination and library knowledge, someone would be there to believe them and give them a chance. On the 10th anniversary of that day at the Amarillo Motorcycle Rally, Ethan organized a gathering at his shop. Diesel came, and Pete Rodriguez and Sarah Chen, who flew in from California. Yang sent a video message from his shop in Los Angeles. They ate barbecue and told stories and looked at the knucklehead that had started everything. To the kid who could fix anything, Diesel proposed a toast. Yes, and to everyone who was smart enough to get out of his way and let him prove it. They raised their beers while Ethan, now 23 and running a successful business, thought about the terrified teenager who'd ridden his bicycle 11 miles to see motorcycles he'd only read about in books. That boy had believed that knowledge and effort could overcome poverty and circumstance. 10 years later, the evidence suggested he'd been right. The work continued. Young mechanics to train, complex problems to solve, beautiful machines to build. And somewhere in Amarillo, a 13-year-old kid was probably reading engineering texts at the library, dreaming about motorcycles, waiting for someone to give them a chance to prove what they could do. When that kid showed up at Cole Custom Engineering, Ethan would be ready to listen, because he remembered what it felt like to whisper, "I can fix that," and have someone respond with belief instead of dismissal. That moment had changed his life. He planned to create that moment for as many others as he possibly could.